Hey, this is from Edmund Husserl's article that he published in the Encyclopaedia Britannica in 1927 about phenomenology. It's on phenomenological psychology and transcendental phenomenology. Um, part 16 says, the phenomenological resolution of all philosophical antitheses. In the systematic work of phenomenology, which progresses from intuitively given concrete data to heights of abstraction, the old traditional ambiguous antitheses of the philosophical standpoint are resolved, by themselves and without the arts of an argumentative dialectic, and without weak efforts and compromises, oppositions such as between rationalism, Platonism, and empiricism, relativism and absolutism, subjectivism and objectivism, ontologism and transcendentalism, psychologism and anti-psychologism, positivism and metaphysics, or the teleological versus the causal interpretation of the world. Throughout all of these, one finds justified motives, but throughout also half-truths or impermissible absolutizing of only relatively and abstractively legitimate one-sidedness. Okay, so Husserl is saying that only phenomenology can move beyond these supposed philosophical antitheses. So this is where it gets cool. Husserl writes, subjectivism can only be overcome by the most all-embracing and consistent subjectivism, the transcendental. In this latter form, it is at the same time objectivism of a deeper sort, in that it represents the claims of whatever objectivity is to be demonstrated through concordant experience, but admittedly, this is an objectivism which also brings out its full and genuine sense, against which sense the supposedly realistic objectivism sins by its failure to understand transcendental constitution. Relativism can only be overcome through the most all-embracing relativism, that of transcendental phenomenology, which makes intelligible the relativity of all objective being or existence as transcendentally constituted. But at one with this, it makes intelligible the most radical relativity. So it says, but at one with this, it makes intelligible the most radical relativity, the relatedness of the transcendental subjectivity to itself. So he says that the most radical relativity is the relatedness of the transcendental subjectivity to transcendental subjectivity itself, to itself. But just this relatedness, subjectivity, proves its identity to be the only possible sense of the term absolute being, over and against all objective being that is relative to it, namely, as the for itself, being of transcendental subjectivity. Likewise, empiricism can only be overcome by the most universal and consistent empiricism, which puts in place of the restricted term experience of the empiricist the necessarily broadened concept of experience, inclusive of intuition, which offers original data, and intuition which in all its forms, intuition of eidos, of apodictic self-evidence, phenomenological intuition of essence, etc., shows the manner and form of its legitimation through phenomenological clarification. Phenomenology as eidetic is, on the other hand, rationalistic. It overcomes restrictive and dogmatic rationalism, however, through the most universal rationalism of inquiry into essence, which is related uniformly to transcendental subjectivity, to the I, consciousness, and conscious objectivity. So he says, finally he says, and is the same in reference to the other antithesis bound up with them. The tracing back of all being to the transcendental subjectivity and its constitutive intentional functions leaves open, to mention one more thing, no other way of contemplating the world than the teleological. And yet, phenomenology also acknowledges a kernel of truth in naturalism, or rather sensationism. That is, by revealing associations as intentional phenomena, indeed, as a whole basic typology of forms of passive intentional synthesis with transcendental and purely passive genesis based on essential laws, phenomenology shows Humean fictionalism to contain anticipatory discoveries, particularly in Hume's doctrine of the origin of such fictions as thing, persisting existence, causality, anticipatory discoveries all shrouded in absurd theories. I leave it to you, the listener and the observer of these videos, to interpret that for yourself, to look into um, that article for yourself. You can Google it, try to read it, understand what it means. I'll try to post some videos on my own interpretation of it and try to clarify exactly what he means by phenomenology and how subjectivism and relativism, empiricism, um, rationalism, and the teleological versus causal views of the world, how they can only be overcome through a radicalizing, through their own by pushing the truths that they have found to their limits, in order to show where in the realm of truth, in order to put them in their place, so to speak, in order to take all of what is true, since all of these antitheses are essentially the result of a history of of what Husserl calls transcendental subjectivity. It's all um, it's all basically, not, I don't want to say consciousness, but it's, in some sense we might say it's all mind. If we don't want to say subjectivity, it's all coming from mind. I mean, not that the world just not that nothing exists, or that the real world doesn't exist outside of the mind. That's not quite what Husserl's saying. He's saying that that we can't like the world as the world, the world as we know it, with determinate things and all of the meaning that we ascribe to it, that wouldn't exist except for the mind, and the mind couldn't exist without the world at the same time. But he's got a kind of idealism going on, but it's not subjective idealism. It's a transcendental idealism, and what the task that Husserl has to explain is, or wants to undertake in describing and laying out, is how that's possible. I mean, how is it possible that there's this kind of paradox that the world must be entirely relative to the mind. In that sense, the mind is absolute. The mind is, in the sense that the mind is given to itself, by itself, and that the mind constitutes, or the mind allows the world to show up in the particular way that it does, for the mind, in such a way that it actually appears to be independent and have its own autonomous existence. The world shows up, the objects in the world show up as pre-given, as if I didn't even need to perceive them to allow the phenomenal being of this being to manifest itself. It seems like the world exists objectively and in itself, independently of me, because I just turn around and it's there. It's like the refrigerator. It's like the light inside the refrigerator. You open up the refrigerator. It seems like the light's on all the time, but it's only on when you open it. And the trick is, well, these are both true. The world must come essentially from subjectivity itself, but at the same time, we have to admit that it shows up as being independent of subjectivity, and that's the goal, is to try to understand that. And the only way we can understand and explain or describe all that is by radicalizing all of the truths that we find in these positions, like we outlined earlier. Thanks.